Hey there, welcome to my Tazavesh Streets of Wonder guide. I decided to make a guide on the Tazavesh dungeons in Mythic Plus for those who wish to get into WoW, specifically Mythic Plus. If you're in a rush and just want priority kicks and boss mechanics, then you may be interested in my too long didn't watch version of this guide. If you're already familiar with the dungeon mechanics and would like to experiment with routes, you may be interested in my routes video. In this video, I'll cover all enemies you will encounter in the main route, and highlight which enemies are particularly deadly. I'll be showing a tooltip of all enemy abilities on screen. If they're in green, that means they're not too important, usually only becoming noticeable on higher keys. If they're in red, that means they're a core ability of enemies in the dungeon and should be prioritized. The dungeon starts with some roleplay, where Gate Warden Zomaz forbids your entry from Tazavesh and tries to beat you up. This pull consists of the Gatekeeper himself and 2 custom security. Let's talk about the custom security first. Their important ability is Disruption Grenade, where they spawn a grenade at the feet of a random ranged player, and after a delay, the grenade does massive damage to anyone caught in its radius. It only spawns on ranged DPS, so ranged DPS just step out of it when it becomes a problem. Custom Security also cast Hardlight Baton, which grants them a magic buff which causes their attacks to deal additional damage. This can be dispelled by priests, shaman, and mages. Custom Security also teleport towards the tank when the tank goes farther than a few yards. So if it's necrotic weak, your tank cannot kite them, unless they're stunned. As for the Gatekeeper himself, Zomaz casts Radiant Pulse. Radiant Pulse deals significant damage to the entire party and is not avoidable, so I highly recommend using a defensive when he does it. Zomaz also casts Proxy Strike, which is a tank buster, so your tank will need to mitigate this. In this next pull, there's going to be 1 custom security, 1 support officer, and 1 interrogation specialist, and also 1 Nathrezim from this season's Affix. As a reminder, you'll be avoiding the grenades and dispelling hardlight batons from the custom security. Let's start with the support officer. Support officers start with a refraction shield, which reflects some damage dealt to them. You can dispel this. Support officers cast Hardlight Barrier, an interruptible ability that applies a large shield to a random enemy. If you miss the interrupt, you can dispel it. Last, for support officers, is Hyperlight Bolt. It does damage exclusively to the tank or their current target. As for interrogation specialists, they cast Stasis Beam. On completing a short channel, they'll lock 1 player down, stunning them for 3 seconds. This can potentially stun someone in a grenade, which will mean certain death for that player. Interrogation specialists also cast Spark Burn. It does damage to a random party member. This next pull is a large one. I often opt to pull 2 packs at the same time. It'll have at least 1 of each type of mob, and it will have 1 Nathrezim inside it. As a reminder, you want to dodge grenades, kick stasis beams, and kick or dispel hard light barriers. The new enemy here is the Armored Overseer. Their important ability is Beam Splicer. It is extremely deadly and does a lot of damage. On cast, a small ball of light spawns near a random player, and after a short delay, it opens up and light beams spawn, rotating clockwise. The beams spawn typically facing the Overseer, so don't stand between the ball and the Overseer. If you are hit by the beam, you will receive a dot that does significant damage over 6 seconds. It is potentially lethal at higher levels. Armored Overseers also cast Proxy Strike, which is a tank buster, so please mitigate these tanks. And that covers most of the enemies in this area. Now we proceed to fight a mini-boss. Portalmancer Zohan is a mini-boss that must be defeated to spawn the first boss. He starts by casting Radiant Pulse, just like the Gatekeeper Zomaz from earlier. However, unlike Zomaz, we can line of sight Radiant Pulse. Normally you take him to this wall, and everyone line of sight around this wall before he finished casting Radiant Pulse. Zohan then casts Rift Blasts, but it doesn't immediately do anything. Instead, for the rest of the fight, portals will spawn continuously. Don't stand in their path. Zohan then casts Empowered Glyph of Restraint, which if left unkicked will apply a certainly lethal dot to your party. You will die. It is a priority kick, but it can be difficult because it has a 1-second cast time, so you'll need to be quick. If you happen to miss it and you have a priest, they can mass dispel it. A helpful tip is that the first time you fight Zohan, He immediately casts Glyph of Restraint after he casts Rift Blasts. You can prepare your mind to immediately kick as he starts casting. Lastly, Zohan casts Hyper Light Bolt at your tank. It only does damage, and it's not really that impactful, so you can choose to use your kick here, or you could save it for the empowered Glyph of Restraint. Upon defeating Zohan, Zofex the Sentinel enters the room. The fight starts with Zofex detaching 2 of his arms to spawn 2 spinning circles, which do damage to players caught in them. The Zofex also has a shield called Rotary Body Armor, which absorbs all attacks from the direction it's facing. You'll want to move around it, and it moves counterclockwise, so you can move clockwise around it. This next mechanic is primarily for the tank. After the boss detaches 2 of his arms, he will only be left with 2 arms. After he casts Fully Armed, he regains both lost limbs and does an additional 25% damage. You'll want to use some defensives here. The boss also casts Impound Contraband, which disarms 2 players, silencing them and preventing them from casting abilities. To rearm yourself, you'll need to pick up your dropped weapons. Sometimes these weapons can drop inside the spinning blades, so you'll have to make a quick in and out, and you can rejoin the fight. Finally is Interrogation. Zofex, after a short cast time, traps a player in a containment cell, and starts walking towards that cell. Zofex deals lethal damage to anyone caught in his path, so don't stand in front of him. Likewise, Zofex also instantly kills the player when he reaches the containment cell. You will be unable to move while in the containment cell. You will be stunned and you'll have to rely on your team to break you out. To give your team more time to destroy the cell, when the boss casts Interrogation at you, you'll want to run as far away from the boss as you possibly can. The containment cell does continuous damage to the player inside the cell, so healers will need to keep them topped up. Interrogation is a stun, so you can use stun immunities to break out of it. Before you're trapped in the cell, you can cast Anti-Magic Shield, Turtle, Ice Block, or Potion of Unhindered Passing. If you're a human, after you get stunned, you can use your human racial. After the boss, there are 2 more pulls here in this area. The first is nothing unique, all enemies we've seen before, but the 2 armored overseers at the door are slightly more difficult, because one of them is actually the Nathrezim miniboss. What follows next is the Left Streets route. I personally find it easier, and the enemies here are good for enemy forces count. If you wish to experiment with other routes, maybe modify portions of this route or the other route, I invite you to watch the routes video for Streets. Going left, you first face Tracker Zo'Course. Upon entering combat, Zo'Course casts Chain of Custody, which immediately pulls all members of the party to be within 10 yards of him, and you will be forced to remain within 10 yards of him for the rest of this fight. Just like Armored Overseers, he casts Beam Splicers. But now that you are linked to the miniboss, you'll need to trust your tank to position the party well enough to avoid Splicers. Zo'Course also casts Lockdown, which roots the tank for 10 seconds. The healer will need to dispel it off the tank to allow the tank to reposition the party. After the tracker are 2 Ancient Corehounds, fresh from the Molten Core. They start by casting Ancient Dread at around the same time. If you don't interrupt it, everyone will receive a debuff that reduces their cast speed by 50%. You cannot let this go off, as it is a major DPS and HPS loss. If you happen to miss it, it is a curse, so you can decurse it. The Corehounds also cast Lava Breath, which does great damage to players in a cone in front of them. This really hurts, so tank face them away and mitigate or interrupt it. Finally, you'll also need to kill the Corehounds within about 8 seconds of each other, or else the dead one will respawn. Following the Ancient Corehounds is an Enraged Direhorn. The Enraged Direhorn starts by casting Frenzied Charge at a party member. If you do not stand on that pedestal, you will be charged. Any players caught in the Direhorn's path will be stunned. After the charge, the Direhorn casts Wild Thrash, which deals damage to any players within 8 yards of the Direhorn. And lastly, down the steps are Frenzied Nightclaws. They're not very dangerous, as they only really cast Fanatic Grip. They jump to a random player farther than 8 yards, so just stay in melee to avoid getting jumped on. It is here, however, that we find 2 shady dealers that turn into Nathrezim nearby. It's actually a good idea to pull them both into the pack and burn them all down together. This will grant you 2 stacks of the Nathrezim buff. There are portals located around the map that allow you to fast travel back to locations in case you wipe. This is the first one, and this is the second one. You can access these through the portals in the first boss's room. This next pack we pull into the boss room, as this allows us to start the boss RP and have something to do while waiting. Drag everyone into the boss room, and once you hear the talking, you know that the RP has started. There are going to be 2 Natharazim in this pull, as there is a Shady Dealer in the hallway, and only 1 Peacekeeper. Peacekeeper has an ability called Phalanx Field, which is a hard channel that reduces their damage taken from magic abilities by 75%. You can use the stun here to continue killing them. Beside that, they also have Quelling Strike, where they charge a player who is 10 or more yards away from them, dealing significant damage and interrupting them. You might not want to pull this into the boss, as it can be a bit hectic. So stand in the hallway, and when the boss crosses the door frame, he will be reset. This next fight is a 3-boss fight, and it first starts with a Devourer. When the boss spawns, they cast Gluttony, a debuff that is applied to the nearest player. This debuff does damage to them and any allies within a few yards. This debuff transfers to the nearest player upon expiration, and will last for the whole fight. After that, the boss first casts Grip of Hunger, pulling all players towards them. After that, the boss will stomp the ground, dealing some damage. You'll want to walk out of it. The boss also casts Grand Consumption, which spawns 2 sets of bombs that explode after a short delay. You'll want to avoid these, as they do heal the boss slightly. When the boss reaches 40% health, the RP for the next boss happens. At the end of the RP, that next boss will spawn and join the fight. As it is time controlled, it is possible that you will have 2 bosses up at the same time. Watch out for that. The robot boss starts by casting Purification Protocol, applying a debuff on 2 players. These debuffs cause a large circle to spawn around these players, and after a short delay, these large circles explode, dealing damage to any player caught in their radius. The healer should dispel one of these debuffs, and the player with the other debuff should run out of the group. The boss then casts Flagellation Protocol, encasing them in a shield that renders them immune to interrupts. He then begins to pummel the tank, dealing a significant amount of damage. To interrupt this pummeling, you'll need to either destroy or dispel the shield and interrupt the boss. Next is Venting Protocol, which knocks back all players near the boss and launches 5 Anima Orbs in 5 different directions 3 times, for a total of 15 balls. If the tank positions the boss in the corner, at least 2 of these 5 balls will be trapped in the corner, resulting in fewer balls bouncing around the room. As for the balls themselves, touching these orbs will make you take damage and gain a debuff, which reduces your damage done by 5%. This effect stacks if you pick up multiple orbs. However, the person with Gluttony at that moment can absorb these balls safely. Not only do they ignore the damage, picking up the orbs also grants that player a stacking 5% buff. The person with Gluttony can walk into that trap corner and pick up all the trapped balls, immediately granting them a great amount of stacks to boost their damage significantly. As the person with Gluttony, you'll want to absorb orbs actively to reduce the chaos in the room. Finally, at 40%, the RP for the last boss starts, and after a while that last boss will spawn. This short period where the robot and girl are alive is a dangerous overlap, and Lust may be useful to finish them off here. Note that when the robot dies, their corpse continues to vent anima, and Gluttony remains in play. Final boss only has 2 mechanics. First casts Chain of Damnation, which traps a player in chains, rendering them 100% slowed for its duration. You'll need to break the chains to free that player before she casts her next mechanic, Whirling Annihilation. Whirling Annihilation is an ability where the boss spins like mad and starts pulling all party members towards her. Players trapped in the chain will be unable to run away from the boss and will almost certainly die. Just run away to avoid getting hit. After the menagerie, you then face the last mini-boss of the dungeon, Commander Zo'far. To begin, you'll want 1 player, ranged DPS or healer, to stand here, and everyone else to stand on the other side with the tank. Zo'far starts by casting Shock Mines, throwing mines around himself. It always spawns at least 8 yards away from him and within line of sight. So if you stack with the tank, you should be fine. Zo'far then casts Lethal Force, connecting the closest and farthest player from him with a beam. This beam will pull these 2 players together, and should they touch, Both would receive a dot that would be lethal almost certainly. You can use this small wall to separate the two players. If done correctly, you don't have to manage this mechanic at all. Finally, Zo'far kicks the tank away from himself. It is for this reason that the tank has his back to the wall, so that when he is kicked, he barely moves. After Zo'far, there's going to be one mob that you'll want to skip. You can skip it with Mind Soothe, Imprison, Sap, or Ring of Peace and Paralysis. The meta for Season 4 Market Minigame is slightly different from the last season. To begin with, you want one DPS or healer to walk into the marketplace to start the minigame. Then you'll return, and the tank will pull both packs left and right of the Mailroom and kill them both together. After destroying these two packs, you'll want the whole team to go to the marketplace, do the marketplace minigame, and continue on to Mize's Oasis. Most of the mobs in the Mailroom aren't very impactful. Main elementals have Throw Junk and Spam Filter. Throw Junk does damage to a random player. Spam Filter applies a 50% DR to a random enemy. You'll want to kick or dispel this. Post Workers cast Letter Opener, which applies a bleed to your tank, and Postage Stamp, which just does damage to your tank. Effective Sorters cast Open Cage, where they'll open up one of the containment cells, either letting out an army of chickens to stun your team, or a smuggled creature, which is just another mob to burn. Effective Sorters also have Mail Shoot, which does damage to the tank and any players within 3 yards of the tank. So don't stand near the tank. As for the marketplace minigames, how it works is, you buy an item from this guy. You'll want to pick up this item, and bring it to the corresponding broker. In this case, we got a cracked Warhammer. You'll want to bring this to a magical weapons expert, Zai Jahid. You'll repeat this process 3 times, where upon the 3rd time you do it, you'll instead receive a password instead of a new item. You then talk to the guard outside and give him the password to enter the Oasis and start the boss fight. When you enter the room, you'll start by picking up an instrument. Normally, the tank takes the one in the front, the healer the one in the back, and the 3 DPS the 3 in the middle. Now you get to play in a band. When the fight starts, notes will appear on the ground, and after 3 have spawned, they will light up, and you can pop them using your instrument. As a DPS, you slide in a straight line to pass through the 3 notes. 12 notes will spawn, in sets of 3. Hitting 10 out of 12 notes will grant you a buff, which increases your haste and damage by 25%. This buff lasts for 40 seconds. Throughout the fight, you'll be pelted by rotten food from the audience. Be sure not to get hit by this rotten food. A set of ads will spawn, 2 Brawling Patrons, 1 Disruptive Patron, and 1 Oasis Security. The Brawling Patrons cast an ability which does damage to their current target, the tank. Next, Oasis Security casts Security Slam, which is a tank buster. You'll want to mitigate these tanks. Oasis Security also casts Menacing Shout, which deals unmitigatable damage to the entire party. This is a priority kick. Disruptive Patron casts Hyperlight Bolt, dealing damage to the tank. Disruptive Patron also casts Teleport. While not dangerous, it will lengthen the pull, and therefore is important to keep it locked down. You'll want to stun this, as if you do not kill this pack fast enough, after 40 seconds, not only will you lose your buff, the ads will enrage and deal 100% increased damage. After defeating them, you take your places again and play your instruments once again. After hitting 12 notes, another set of ads will spawn, the same set of ads. You might want to pull the Shady Dealer in to kill with either one of these 2 packs. You'll take your places once more, and play your notes once again. Except this time, you'll draw the ire of the boss, Zogran. Zogran casts Security Slam just like the Oasis Security. Tanks mitigate this. Just like Oasis Security, Zogran also casts Menacing Shout. You'll want to interrupt this. The boss also casts Suppression Spark. He pulls all players towards the center of the stage. Upon finishing his cast, any players within 7 yards of another player will take significant damage. You'll want to stay in the center and wait for your notes to spawn. Once your notes have lit up, you can use your instrument to dash out of the center and pick up your nose. Not only does this take you away from the center, away from your team, preventing you from taking lethal damage, it also refreshes your buff back to 40 seconds. The boss also casts Crowd Control, which absorbs all damage from a certain direction for its duration. Upon completing the cast, he deals significant damage to anyone in that direction. Then we return to the Mailroom, where we kill the last 3 trash mobs of the dungeon. Around the corner there is a Nathrezim. You might want to pull him into this pack for an extra buff. You'll want to kill the Mail Elemental last, as they drop a bubble upon death which grants any character, friend or foe, a 30% haste buff. You can drag the Mail Elemental to the center of the room by running all the way across the room. It is here that we pull the boss. He starts the fight by casting Hazardous Liquids, where he throws vials of liquids wildly around the room. You can either absorb these by standing in them before they land, or letting them hit the ground. Letting them hit the ground spawns permanent puddles which last for the rest of the fight. You'll want to generally absorb the ones near the center of the room. Absorbing these vials applies a magic debuff, which does a lot of damage to you, but it can be dispelled. Immediately after this, he casts Fan Mail, which continuously does significant damage to everyone in the party. The damage from both the vial and the Fan Mail can be overwhelming, so try not to soak vials if you know you can't survive both. To top it all off, immediately after casting Fan Mail, he casts Money Order. The boss spawns a portal above one player, and after a few seconds drops a ball of gold from the sky. The ball of gold does significant damage, but the damage is spread evenly amongst all players caught within. You want the whole party to stack up and spread this damage together. This rapid fire mechanics is extremely taxing for your healer, so you'll want to use a few defensives here and there. Last, he casts Unstable Goods, where he summons 7 briefcases around the room. Each briefcase has an independent timer which indicates time left before kaboom. You want to pick up a briefcase and throw it at an open chute. There will be 1 chute marked out. If they're red, that means they're not open. If they're yellow, that means they're either about to open or about to close. If they're blue, that means they're the chute you need to throw it at. You'll want to throw the briefcase into the chute. Missing will cause it to explode, dealing damage to the whole party. Letting the briefcase time out will make it explode, dealing damage to the whole party. With that, we move on to the last boss, Zoasmi. Zoasmi starts the fight by casting Quick Blade, where he jumps to 3 random players, applying a bleed to anyone caught in his path. The boss will spawn 6 portals around the room. Each portal is marked with a symbol, and there are 6 portals, 3 pairs. Going into one portal takes you out the other. For example, going into this triangle portal takes you out the other. These portals are crucial for dodging his next ability, Shuri. It starts as a ball of light, and starts expanding as a wave of energy. Getting hit by this wave applies a lethal dot to you. To avoid this wave, you must take a portal from outside of the circle to within. A good portion of this fight will involve you searching for Shuri spawn and going through portals to avoid Shuri. This task becomes far more difficult when he casts his next ability, Divide. The boss physically divides the room into health, and subsequently at a lower health threshold into quarters. Often, after he casts Divide, he subsequently casts Double Technique. Double Technique is a unique ability that needs to be interrupted twice. You would normally have one player kick it early, and have the tank kick it second late. Note that the duration of the second interrupt is equal to the remaining duration of the first interrupt, so there's no point in holding your first interrupt. Failing to kick this twice will result in significant damage that will wipe the whole party. The hardest part of this fight is when the room is split into quarters. Sometimes to avoid Shuri, you'll need to go through 3 different portals. To master this fight, you must be able to process your environment quickly, and be able to determine which portals to go through to avoid Shuri. And that's Tazavesh Streets of Wonder. I hope you look forward to doing the dungeon itself in Shadowlands Season 4. Among Shadowlands dungeons, Tazavesh is by far the most flavorful and fun. And many of the mechanics are rather cute. I know it can be intimidating playing Mythic Plus, especially if you aren't caught up with all the dungeon mechanics. I hope this video taught you something new about Streets. I plan on making a guide for all other Season 4 dungeons too, so be sure to subscribe if you want to catch those. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next dungeon guide.